A homeless man gave away his only protection against the bitter cold, a tattered blanket, to save a shivering stranger. In that moment of sacrifice, he couldn't have known he was changing not just one life, but two. Months passed as he fought to survive on the unforgiving streets, never expecting anything in return. But sometimes, the universe has a way of remembering even the smallest acts of kindness. Michael had called the streets home for 3 long, grueling years. Each day was a battle, and his worldly possessions fit into a weathered backpack, a few tattered clothes, a plastic water bottle filled with murky liquid, and his most prized possession, a thick wool blanket that had become his lifeline during the harsh winter nights. But this December was different. The temperature had plummeted to record lows, and the bitter wind howled through the city like a haunting ghost, cutting through the air with sharpened steel. Even the most hardened street dwellers, those who had long since grown accustomed to the cruelty of the elements, sought shelter wherever they could find it. The biting chill seeped into their bones, leaving them shivering and desperate for warmth. For Michael, the abandoned underpass was the best he could manage. It was a dark, lonely place where the shadows clung to the walls like secrets. Huddled against the cold concrete, he wrapped his blanket tightly around his shoulders, the frayed edges barely long enough to cover his tall, lean frame. That blanket wasn't just a source of warmth, it was survival itself. A gift from the only shelter volunteer who had treated him like a human being before the facility had closed down for good last year. It was more than fabric. It was a reminder of kindness in a world that had largely forgotten him. As the frigid air nipped at his exposed skin, Michael closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be warm, to be safe, to feel the gentle embrace of a home and the soft laughter of family around him. Memories of a time long gone flashed through his mind, dinners shared, holidays celebrated, and the comfort of a warm bed. But those days felt like distant echoes, fading away with each passing moment on the streets. Around him, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to his plight. Cars rushed by, their headlights illuminating the night, while laughter and music spilled out from nearby bars and restaurants. It was a world filled with warmth and connection, a stark contrast to the isolation that wrapped around him like a heavy cloak. He could hear snippets of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the joyous sounds of people celebrating life. And for a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of longing in his heart. But on this freezing night, as he pulled his blanket tighter around him, an unexpected encounter would soon test his will in ways he could never have imagined. Just a few feet away, a figure emerged from the shadows, shivering and stumbling, clearly in search of refuge from the relentless cold. The stranger's presence stirred something deep within Michael, igniting a flicker of compassion that had been buried beneath layers of survival instinct. Little did he know, this moment of connection would alter the course of his life forever. The stranger stumbled into Michael's makeshift sanctuary just after midnight, his silhouette emerging from the swirling darkness like an apparition. He was a tall man, dressed in what had once been an immaculate business suit, now rumpled and completely unsuited for the brutal winter night that had descended upon the city. His expensive leather shoes, polished to a high shine earlier that day, scraped against the rough concrete as he collapsed against the wall. His entire body racked with violent shivers that seemed to shake him to his very core. His lips had taken on a frightening blue tinge, and his eyes held the distant, confused look of someone battling the early stages of hypothermia. "Help," the man managed through chattering teeth, each word a struggle against the cold that had seized his body. "My kick car broke down, phone dead. Walked for miles, got lost so cold. Michael instinctively pulled back into the shadows, tightening his grip on his blanket until his knuckles turned white. Years on the street had taught him caution. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when survival hung by such a delicate thread. For all he knew, this could be an elaborate trap, a cleverly disguised ploy to steal the little he had left. He'd seen it before. Desperation driving people to terrible acts, and those who lived on the streets were often the easiest targets. But as the stranger's shivering intensified, something stirred in Michael's chest. A feeling he had nearly forgotten existed. Compassion, empathy, the recognition of another human being in distress. He recognized the early signs of hypothermia from his own close calls with the condition. The confusion, the violent shivering, the slurred speech. Without intervention, this man might not survive the night. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the wind chill made it feel even more deadly. "You need to get warm," Michael said, his voice rough from disuse, the words scraping against his throat like sandpaper. It had been days since he'd spoken to another person. The stranger nodded weakly, rubbing his hands together in a futile attempt to generate heat, the friction barely enough to make a difference against the bone-deep cold. "I'll be okay. Just need to rest a minute. I didn't think it would be this cold. Wasn't prepared." Michael knew better. The temperature was still dropping, and the wind howled through the underpass like a hungry predator searching for prey. The forecast had predicted the coldest night of the year, and even the shelters were overflowing. He looked down at his blanket, his only real protection against the elements. The wool was worn thin in places, patched in others, but it still held warmth like a faithful friend. It had kept him alive through countless freezing nights when the temperature plummeted and the world turned hostile. His mind raced with calculations, weighing options against consequences. Could they both fit under it? No, it was barely large enough for him alone, and sharing such close quarters with a stranger posed its own risks. Could he spare it for a few hours? The night was long, and the coldest hours were still ahead, the pre-dawn darkness when the temperature would drop even further. If he gave up his blanket, what would protect him from the merciless cold that had claimed the lives of so many others on the streets? The stranger's breathing had become shallow and irregular, his eyes unfocused as they stared at nothing in particular. His shivering had grown more violent, then worryingly less intense, a dangerous sign that his body was beginning to surrender to the cold. Time was running out. Michael thought about all the people who had passed him by over the years, the averted gazes, the quickened steps, the occasional look of disgust or pity. How many times had he reached out, only to be treated as if he were invisible, as if his very existence was an inconvenience to be ignored? Society had a way of looking through the homeless, seeing them as problems rather than people with stories, dreams, and dignity. With trembling hands, partly from cold, partly from the weight of his decision, Michael slowly unwrapped the blanket from his shoulders. The frigid air immediately assaulted him, seeping through his layers of clothing like icy fingers, chilling him to the bone. The warmth he had carefully cultivated throughout the evening dissipated in seconds, leaving him vulnerable to the night's brutal embrace. "Here," he said, his voice softer now as he draped the blanket over the stranger's shoulders with surprising gentleness. "Take it. It's not much, but it'll help." The man looked up, confusion mixing with gratitude in his eyes as the warmth of the blanket began to envelop him. "But what about you? This is yours. You need it." Michael shrugged, already feeling the cold's bite as it nipped at his exposed skin and seeped through his threadbare jacket. "I'm used to it," he lied, knowing full well that no one ever truly gets used to such cold. "Been out here long enough to know how to handle it." As the stranger pulled the blanket tightly around himself, Michael retreated to the opposite wall, tucking his hands into his armpits for warmth and pulling his knees to his chest to conserve body heat. He would have to keep moving tonight, perhaps walk until morning to keep his blood flowing, finding momentary shelter in 24-hour establishments if security would allow it. It would be a long, painful night, but he'd survived worse. At least, that's what he told himself. The stranger's shivering gradually subsided as the blanket worked its simple magic, trapping his body heat and creating a cocoon of warmth against the winter's assault. Color slowly returned to his face, the alarming blue tinge of his lips fading to a more natural pink as circulation improved. His breathing steadied, becoming deeper and more regular. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier now, the words clear and deliberate. "I don't even know your name." "Michael," he replied simply, stamping his feet to fight the numbness creeping into his toes. He didn't offer a last name. Last names belonged to a different life, one with addresses and bank accounts and people who expected you home for dinner. "I'm James," the stranger said, studying Michael with newfound clarity in his eyes, as if truly seeing him for the first time. "James Harrington. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. This blanket, it's clearly important to you." Michael didn't have a philosophical answer ready, no grand statement about human kindness or moral obligation. He just offered the simple truth. "Because you needed it more than me right now. That's all there is to it." As the night wore on, they talked intermittently, James explaining how his car had broken down miles away on a deserted stretch of road, how his cell phone had died earlier in the day, and how he'd tried to walk to find help but had gotten disoriented in the unfamiliar part of town. The neighborhood had changed drastically since he'd last visited years ago, and in the darkness, all landmarks had disappeared, leaving him lost and increasingly desperate as the temperature continued to drop. Michael listened, occasionally sharing small details of his own life. How he'd once been a construction worker before an injury and subsequent addiction had cost him everything. How he'd been clean for 8 months now, but couldn't find steady work without an address. How the system seemed designed to keep people like him trapped in their circumstances. He was careful not to reveal too much, years of street wisdom having taught him that vulnerability could be exploited. Between conversations, silence fell, not uncomfortable but contemplative, filled with the ambient sounds of the city at night, distant sirens, the occasional car passing overhead, the wind whistling through the concrete structure. In those quiet moments, both men seemed to reflect on the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Two lives that would never have intersected if not for a broken-down car and a wrong turn. By dawn, as the first pale light began to filter through the city, James had recovered enough to leave. His body temperature normalized and his strength returned. He stood awkwardly with the blanket still wrapped around him, clearly torn between his need to return to his world and his reluctance to leave Michael without protection. "I need to get home, but I want to return this to you," James said, his fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "It saved my life. I won't forget that." Michael nodded, not believing him, for a second. No one ever came back. That wasn't how the world worked, especially not for people like him. People made promises in moments of gratitude, but those promises evaporated in the light of day. washed away by the return to normal life and its comfortable distractions. "Where can I find you?" James asked, his brow furrowed with what appeared to be genuine concern. "I want to properly thank you." "Around," Michael answered vaguely, a half-smile playing at the corners of his chapped lips. Experience had taught him that specifics were dangerous, that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I move around a lot. Nowhere specific," as James reluctantly departed, casting one last troubled glance over his shoulder before disappearing around the corner. Michael huddled deeper into the corner of the underpass, exhausted from a sleepless night fighting the cold. His body ached from the constant tension of shivering, and a persistent cough had settled in his chest, a worrying rattle that spoke of the toll the night had taken. He closed his eyes, trying to capture a few moments of rest before he would need to move on. Before the city fully awoke and the authorities came to clear out the underpass of undesirables. As consciousness began to slip away, he thought briefly of his blanket, now gone, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But there was also a strange sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that transcended his physical discomfort. In a world that had taken nearly everything from him, he had still found something to give. What our homeless hero didn't realize was that this simple act of kindness, this sacrifice made without expectation of reward or recognition, had just set in motion events that would completely transform his life in ways he could never have imagined. For James Harrington was not just any stranger, and their paths crossing was not the end of their story, but merely its beginning. 3 days had passed since Michael gave away his blanket. 3 brutal, merciless days of winter at its worst, with temperatures plummeting to record lows and wind chills that cut through the city like sharpened blades. The cough that had started that night had deepened, settling into his lungs with a frightening persistence, rattling in his chest with each labored breath. His body ached with fever, joints stiff and painful, and finding warmth had become his singular focus, overshadowing even his need for food or water. He'd moved from the underpass after a police sweep forced him out, another urban cleanup initiative that treated human beings like refuse to be cleared away. The officers hadn't been particularly cruel, just indifferent, giving the standard warnings about loitering and trespassing before moving him along with practiced efficiency. One young officer had looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic, but remained silent as Michael gathered his meager possessions with trembling hands. Now he huddled in the back corner of a public library, a sanctuary of warmth with its steady hum of heating vents and soft lighting. He was grateful for the few hours of respite before closing time, though he knew it was only temporary relief. The librarians gave him suspicious glances, but left him alone as long as he stayed quiet and didn't disturb the other patrons. One elderly woman at the reference desk seemed to recognize him from previous visits and had quietly placed a cup of tea on his table earlier, pretending she'd forgotten it there. Michael leafed through an old paperback, Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, more for appearance than interest, his feverish mind unable to focus on the words swimming before his eyes. His thoughts kept drifting to the stranger, James, and the blanket that had been his most valuable possession. It had been foolish to give it away, a violation of the first rule of survival on the streets. Look out for yourself first, always. Yet despite his current suffering, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Something about the man's genuine gratitude had fed a part of his soul that had been starving for years, a reminder that he was still capable of making a difference, that his existence still mattered in some small way. A coughing fit seized him, and he quickly buried his face in his elbow to muffle the sound, earning concerned looks from nearby readers. When it finally subsided, he wiped tears from his eyes and noticed a small streak of blood on his sleeve. Not a good sign. "Sir, "We're closing in 15 minutes," a young librarian said, approaching his table with a cart of books. Her voice was gentle but firm, her expression a careful balance of compassion and professional distance. Michael nodded, suppressing another cough that threatened to erupt. "Thank you," he managed, his voice hoarse, back into the cold. The thought filled him with dread, a leaden weight settling in his stomach. The temperature outside had dropped further as night approached, and the prospect of facing it in his weakened state was terrifying. As he slowly gathered himself to leave, the elderly librarian passed by, discreetly sliding a pair of knitted gloves onto his table. "Found these in the lost and found," she whispered. "Been there for months. Better they get used than sit in a box." Before he could respond, she had moved on, busying herself with shutting down computers. Michael stared at the gloves. Simple gray wool, slightly worn but intact, and felt a lump form in his throat. Small kindnesses like this were rare treasures in his world, brief reminders of humanity in a life that often felt stripped of dignity. He slipped them on, flexing his fingers gratefully in their warmth. Meanwhile, across town in a sleek, high-rise office building with a commanding view of the city skyline, James Harrington sat behind an imposing mahogany desk. The CEO of Harrington Enterprises, one of the city's largest development companies with interests spanning real estate, technology, and philanthropy, stared out at the glittering lights below, the blanket that had saved his life folded neatly on his desk, a stark contrast to the modern minimalist design of his office. The blanket looked out of place among the trappings of wealth and power, the original Rothko on the wall, the custom Italian furniture, the latest technology seamlessly integrated into every aspect of the workspace. Yet James found his eyes drawn to it repeatedly throughout the day, his fingers absently tracing its frayed edges during conference calls, as if it contained some essential truth he was still trying to decipher. "Any luck?" he asked, not turning as his executive assistant Charlotte entered the room, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. "Nothing yet, sir," she replied, tablet in hand, her efficiency as impeccable as her appearance. "We've checked with all the shelters, soup kitchens, and outreach programs in the area. No one matching his description has come in recently. Most of these organizations are overwhelmed with the cold snap, and record-keeping isn't exactly their priority right now." James frowned, swiveling his chair to face her. "Expand the search radius. Check hospital admissions, too. And contact Peterson at the police department. See if they've picked anyone up matching Michael's description." Charlotte hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, with all due respect, finding one homeless man in a city this size, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, especially someone who seems to deliberately avoid official channels. Perhaps we could make a donation to homeless services instead? Set up a blanket drive in his honor." James finally turned fully toward her, his expression resolute. "That needle saved my life, Charlotte. I'd be dead if not for him." He ran his fingers over the worn wool blanket, feeling every patch and repair, each one a story he would never know. The temperature was 15 degrees that night. I was already hypothermic when he found me. The doctors confirmed it when I mentioned my symptoms during my checkup. I was maybe an hour away from losing consciousness outdoors. His voice grew quieter. "Do you understand what that means? He gave me his only protection against that kind of cold, knowing what it would mean for him." Charlotte's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I understand, sir. I'll keep looking. Thank you." James stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows. "And Charlotte, this is personal, not business. I don't want this going through official company channels or showing up in any reports to the board. Whatever resources we need, I'll cover personally." After she left, James remained at the window, watching the snow begin to fall again, each flake illuminated by the city lights as they drifted downward. Somewhere out there, the man who had saved him was facing this weather without protection because of a single act of compassion. The search continued for days, growing more comprehensive with each passing hour. James hired a private investigator with experience finding missing persons, visited homeless encampments himself, drawing curious stares in his expensive overcoat, and enlisted the help of local charities by making substantial anonymous donations contingent on their assistance. He distributed photos taken from security cameras near the underpass, offering a reward for information that seemed to grow larger each time he mentioned it. He canceled meetings, delegated responsibilities, and ignored concerned calls from board members questioning his sudden distraction. For perhaps the first time since founding his company 15 years ago, James Harrington had found something more important than business. Back on the streets, Michael's condition worsened with frightening speed. The persistent cough had become debilitating, each spasm sending fire through his lungs and leaving him gasping for breath. Night sweat soaked through his clothes despite the cold, and a persistent lightheadedness made even simple tasks difficult. He'd managed to find a discarded tarp behind a construction site, but it provided little protection against the elements, especially as freezing rain began to mix with the snow. Food had become secondary to finding warmth, though he knew logically that he needed nourishment to fight whatever infection had taken hold. When he could summon the energy, he made his way to a soup kitchen 3 blocks from his current sleeping spot. But the walk felt longer each time, his legs increasingly unsteady beneath him. On the 7th day after their encounter, Michael collapsed outside a convenience store where he'd stopped to warm up briefly. The shop owner, annoyed at having a homeless man driving away customers, had been in the process of asking him to leave when Michael's legs simply gave out, sending him crashing into a display of snack chips before crumpling to the floor. "Great, just great," the owner muttered, reaching for the phone to call the police. "This is exactly what I need today." "He needs an ambulance, not the police," a woman in a nurse's scrubs interjected, kneeling beside Michael's unconscious form. She'd stopped for coffee on her way home from a night shift and quickly assessed the situation with professional eyes. "This man has a dangerously high fever. Call 911 now, or I will." The shop owner, faced with the woman's authoritative tone and the concerned stares of other customers, reluctantly made the call, though he complained about the paperwork and disruption to his business throughout the process. The paramedics arrived quickly, efficiently transferring Michael's limp form onto a stretcher, his breathing labored and wheezing audibly in the quiet store. The nurse provided what information she could, including her suspicion of pneumonia, before the ambulance pulled away, siren cutting through the morning air. At St. Mary's Hospital, the doctors confirmed the nurse's assessment: severe pneumonia, complicated by exposure, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Michael drifted in and out of consciousness during the initial examination, occasionally mumbling about a blanket and someone named James, unaware that his name had just been entered into a database being monitored by James's team. The call came as James was leaving a contentious board meeting, where he'd faced pointed questions about his recent distraction and apparent lack of focus on an upcoming merger. "We found him, sir," Charlotte said, her voice urgent over the speakerphone, as James strode to his private elevator. "He's been admitted to St. Mary's Hospital. It doesn't sound good. They're treating him for severe pneumonia and possible sepsis." James felt his heart rate accelerate. How certain are we that it's him? The description matches, and he was found near the area where you last saw him. He was unconscious upon admission, but apparently he mentioned your name during the initial assessment. Have the car brought around. Cancel everything else today. James ended the call, his decision immediate and unquestioning. The merger, the board's concerns, the quarterly projections, all of it faded to insignificance. Using his considerable influence and a substantial donation to the hospital's foundation that he arranged during the drive over, James bypassed administrative hurdles and was directed to a room in the general ward. He'd expected bureaucratic resistance, but was surprised by how quickly doors opened when he mentioned both his name and his checkbook. The system worked efficiently for those with resources, a stark contrast to Michael's experience, he imagined. What he saw when he entered the room stopped him cold. Michael lay connected to an oxygen machine, IV lines running into both arms, his face gaunt and gray, his breathing shallow despite the assistance. He looked smaller somehow, more fragile than James remembered, his cheekbones sharp beneath his skin, his beard unable to hide the hollowness of his face. A monitor beeped steadily beside the bed, tracking vital signs that James could tell were far from normal. "Are you family?" a nurse asked, entering the room and eyeing James's expensive suit with suspicion. Hospital policy restricted visitors to family members for patients in serious condition. "Yes," James lied without hesitation, the words feeling strangely true even as he spoke them. "I'm his brother." The nurse's expression softened, her initial skepticism replaced by compassion. "He's stabilized for now, but it was close. Another day on the streets?" She didn't need to finish the thought, the implication hanging heavily in the sterile air. "The doctor will be by shortly to discuss his treatment plan. We're administering antibiotics and fluids and monitoring his oxygen levels closely." James approached the bed slowly, the blanket clutched in his hands like an offering. Michael's eyes fluttered open at the sound of footsteps, confusion giving way to recognition as his gaze focused on James's face. "You came back," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the oxygen mask, the words triggering a brief coughing spell that seemed to rack his entire body. James nodded, emotion tightening his throat unexpectedly. "I told you I would." "My blanket?" Michael asked when the coughing subsided, his gaze fixing on the familiar wool in James's hands, a look of childlike relief washing over his features. "I brought it back," James said, gently placing it at the foot of the bed where Michael could see and touch it. "But that's not all I'm here for." Michael's eyebrows raised slightly, a question in his fever-bright eyes. "You saved my life," James continued, pulling a chair close to the bedside and sitting down, leaning forward to ensure Michael could hear him clearly. "Now I want to help save yours. When you're better, we need to talk about your future." Michael managed a weak smile before drifting back to sleep, one hand reaching out to touch the edge of his returned blanket, fingers curling weakly around the fabric as if anchoring himself to something precious. James settled into the chair beside the bed, prepared to wait as long as necessary. He made a few quiet phone calls, one to his assistant canceling his appointments for the remainder of the week, another to his lawyer about setting up a special trust fund, and a third to the hospital administrator about upgrading Michael to a private room with the best care available. His mind was already racing with plans that would change both their lives forever. Because what Michael didn't know was that James Harrington wasn't just wealthy. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, who recognized the rare quality of selflessness that Michael had displayed, and who never forgot a debt. He was a man on a mission to repay something that could never truly be repaid. And that mission was just beginning. Michael awoke to unfamiliar comfort. The harsh fluorescent lights of the general ward had been replaced by soft, recessed lighting that didn't stab at his eyes when he opened them. The thin, plastic-covered hospital mattress had somehow transformed into something that cradled his body perfectly, supporting his aching back and shoulders in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Even the persistent beeping of medical equipment seemed muted, gentler somehow, as if someone had considered that the constant noise might disturb a healing patient. He blinked slowly, his mind still foggy from medication and the lingering effects of fever. This wasn't the same room he remembered being wheeled into after the ambulance ride. A ride that remained fragmented in his memory, just flashes of ceiling lights passing overhead and concerned voices speaking in urgent medical terminology. The walls surrounding him now were a soothing sage green instead of institutional white, adorned with tasteful landscape paintings in elegant frames. A large window with motorized blinds revealed a panoramic view of the city skyline. Snow falling gently against the darkening sky, transforming the urban landscape into something almost magical. And the equipment surrounding him looked newer, more sophisticated than what he'd glimpsed before losing consciousness. Sleek monitors with touch screens rather than the older models he was accustomed to from previous hospital stays. "Welcome back," came a voice from the corner of the room, warm and relieved. Michael turned his head slowly. Even this small movement requiring deliberate effort. To see James rising from a plush leather armchair, positioned near a small seating area he hadn't noticed before. James set aside a tablet computer on a side table made of what appeared to be mahogany, the device automatically dimming as he placed it down. He wore casual clothes now, expensive-looking but simple dark jeans and a charcoal cashmere sweater. A stark contrast to the tailored business suit from their first meeting. His face showed signs of fatigue, with slight shadows under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't been sleeping well. "How long?" Michael asked, his voice raspy and unfamiliar to his own ears, scratchy from disuse and the breathing tube that had apparently been removed at some point during his unconsciousness. 3 days, James replied, approaching the bed with measured steps, as if careful not to move too quickly and startle him. "You've been in and out. Mostly out. The doctors had to perform a thoracentesis to drain fluid from your lungs. It was..." He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't alarm, but would convey the gravity of what had happened. "Touch and go for a while. Your body was severely compromised from exposure and malnutrition. The pneumonia had progressed further than they initially thought." Michael nodded slightly, taking inventory of his body with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating his physical condition for survival. The crushing, stabbing pain in his chest that had made each breath an agony had subsided to a dull, manageable ache. The fever that had left him, alternately freezing and burning, seemed to have broken, no longer sending chills racing through his body. The confusion and disorientation that had clouded his thoughts had cleared somewhat, though he still felt the cottony effects of what he assumed were powerful medications. He still felt profoundly weak, as if his strength had been hollowed out from within. But the desperate, clawing illness that had threatened to drag him under had retreated to a more distant threat. "This isn't the same room," he observed, eyes traveling over details that were becoming clearer as his vision adjusted. The textured wallpaper, the recessed lighting fixtures, the polished hardwood accents that softened the clinical environment. James smiled, reaching for a crystal pitcher on the bedside table and pouring water into a matching glass. "I took the liberty of upgrading your accommodations. Hope you don't mind." The statement was delivered casually, as if arranging a hospital room that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel was a minor courtesy. Michael accepted the water gratefully, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the glass. James gently supported his elbow as he drank, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat in a way that felt almost miraculous. As his senses sharpened, he noticed more details of his surroundings. Fresh flowers arranged in a simple but elegant vase on a side table. What looked like original artwork rather than prints on the walls. A small refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, stocked with what appeared to be juices and healthy snacks. And a tablet mounted on the wall that presumably controlled various aspects of the room. "This is the VIP wing, isn't it?" he asked. A note of wariness entering his voice as the implications of his surroundings began to register more fully. He'd heard about these exclusive hospital accommodations, reserved for the wealthy and well-connected, but had never imagined seeing the inside of one. "I can't afford this. I don't even have insurance." The statement was automatic, a lifetime of financial insecurity making him immediately concerned about costs he could never hope to cover. "It's taken care of," James said simply, his tone brooking no argument. "All of it. The room, the specialists, the treatments, the medications, everything. You don't need to worry about any of that." Michael stared at him, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing, his mind struggling to bridge the vast gap between his reality of counting pennies for a cup of coffee and the casual way this man dismissed what must be astronomical medical expenses. "Why?" he finally asked, the question encompassing far more than just the hospital bill. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." James pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, his expression serious, hands clasped loosely between his knees as he leaned forward. "You gave me your only blanket on the coldest night of the year, Michael. You had every reason to turn me away, to protect yourself. But you didn't." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Do you have any idea how rare that kind of selflessness is? How extraordinary?" Michael looked away, uncomfortable with the praise, with being the focus of such earnest gratitude. His gaze fixed on the snowfall outside the window, finding it easier to watch the hypnotic descent of flakes than to meet the weight of appreciation in James's eyes. "Anyone would have done the same," he murmured, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "No," James said firmly, with the conviction of someone who had given the matter considerable thought. "They wouldn't. I wouldn't have. Not before that night, anyway." He paused, collecting his thoughts, one hand absently adjusting the expensive watch on his wrist, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with his otherwise composed demeanor. "When I got home after our encounter, after warming up and changing into dry clothes and standing in my heated bathroom with every comfort at my fingertips, I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd done, about what it meant." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below, his silhouette framed against the falling snow. "I've spent my life, recovery came slowly for Michael. The pneumonia had taken a greater toll on his body than either he or the doctors had initially realized. Years of living on the streets, of inadequate nutrition, exposure to the elements, and chronic stress had weakened his system in ways that became apparent only as he began to heal. Simple tasks like sitting up unassisted or walking to the bathroom left him winded and exhausted, his muscles trembling with the effort, his lungs still struggling to draw full breaths without triggering painful coughing fits. But the quality of care in the VIP wing was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a stark contrast to his previous encounters with the healthcare system, hurried examinations in overcrowded emergency rooms, where his homeless status often resulted in minimal attention and rapid discharge. Here, a team of specialists visited daily, conferring about his progress in hushed, respectful tones that included him in the conversation rather than talking over him. Physical therapists with gentle hands and encouraging words, helped rebuild his strength through carefully designed exercises tailored to his specific needs. Nutritionists crafted meal plans specifically for his recovery, introducing nutrients his body had been deprived of for years, explaining the healing properties of each ingredient with genuine enthusiasm. Even the housekeeping staff treated him with a respect he had almost forgotten was possible, addressing him as Mr. Sullivan and asking permission before entering his room. Through it all, James was a constant presence. Despite running a multinational corporation with thousands of employees and interests spanning multiple continents, he visited every day, sometimes for hours at a stretch. His arrival became a fixture in Michael's new routine, usually in the late afternoon, often bearing thoughtful gifts that revealed how closely he listened to their conversations. He brought books when Michael mentioned enjoying reading during his younger years, a selection ranging from classic literature to modern bestsellers, each one chosen with consideration rather than randomly selected. He arranged for a television with premium streaming services when the days grew long, showing Michael how to navigate the technology with patience when it proved initially confusing. When Michael offhandedly mentioned missing the taste of his mother's apple pie, a childhood memory he hadn't thought about in decades, a gourmet version appeared the next day, still warm from the oven, Milwaukee's scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filling the room and bringing unexpected tears to Michael's eyes. They talked, cautiously at first, then with growing ease as the days passed. James shared stories of building his business from the ground up, of taking risks that sometimes paid off spectacularly and sometimes failed just as dramatically. He spoke of sleepless nights, worrying about making payroll in the early days, of moments of doubt that nearly caused him to abandon his vision, of the mentors who believed in him when banks wouldn't extend credit. Michael, more hesitantly, revealed fragments of his own past, his work as a carpenter before the economic crash, the craftsmanship he had once taken pride in, the slow spiral into homelessness after losing his job, and then his apartment when his savings were depleted. The strategies he'd developed for survival on the streets, the small kindnesses from strangers that had sustained him when despair threatened to overwhelm him. What surprised Michael most was James's genuine interest. He asked questions not out of politeness, but real curiosity, absorbing Michael's insights about street life with the same intensity he might apply to a business proposal or investment opportunity. There was no pity in his manner, only respect, a quality Michael had grown unaccustomed to receiving. James took notes sometimes, his expensive fountain pen moving across the pages of a leather-bound notebook, particularly when Michael spoke about the systemic failures that trapped people in homelessness. The catch-22 of needing an address to get identification, needing identification to get a job, needing a job to afford housing. The system isn't designed for recovery, Michael explained one afternoon, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks as he warmed to a topic he had thought deeply about during his years on the streets. Once you fall through the cracks, everything is set up to keep you there. The shelters close during the day, forcing you back onto the streets. The jobs that might hire you don't pay enough for housing. The affordable housing has years-long waiting lists. The public bathrooms require purchases to use. It's like trying to climb out of a pit where someone keeps greasing the walls. James nodded, his expression thoughtful as he made another note. And the existing programs? The non-profits and government initiatives? Michael gave a small, rueful smile. They're trying. Many of the people who work there genuinely care. But they're underfunded, overwhelmed, and often restricted by rules that don't match the realities on the ground. They treat the symptoms, not the causes. By the beginning of the third week, Michael had progressed to taking short walks around the hospital floor, each day venturing a little farther than the last. The physical therapist had provided him with a cane, not a standard-issue hospital model, but a handcrafted wooden one that appeared mysteriously one morning. Its polished oak surface, smooth beneath his palm, its weight perfectly balanced. Michael suspected James's involvement, but chose not to ask directly, still uncomfortable with the scale of generosity being shown to him. It was during one of these walks, as they paused by a large window overlooking the city skyline, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, that James finally broached the subject that they had both been circling. "The doctors say you'll be ready for discharge next week," he said, watching as Michael leaned slightly on the window ledge for support, his breathing still careful but no longer labored. Michael nodded, a complicated mix of emotions washing through him. Gratitude for his recovery, anxiety about what came next, a strange reluctance to leave the safety of this cocoon where, for the first time in years, his basic needs were met without struggle. "Back to the streets," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice neutral, to suppress the dread that rose within him at the thought of returning to that life after experiencing its stark contrast. "It doesn't have to be that way," James replied, turning to face him fully, his expression serious yet animated by an underlying energy. "I'd like to make you a proposition." Michael tensed involuntarily, his hand tightening on the cane. Years on the street had taught him to be wary of propositions, of offers that seemed too good to be true, of kindness that came with hidden costs. "What kind of proposition?" he asked, unable to keep the note of suspicion entirely from his voice. James gestured to a small seating area nearby, comfortable chairs arranged around a low table near a decorative indoor fountain whose gentle burbling created a sense of privacy. "Let's sit. This might take a while to explain properly." Once they were settled, James leaned forward, his expression earnest, hands clasped between his knees. "For the past 3 weeks, I've been thinking about how to repay what you did for me. At first, I thought about simply setting you up with an apartment, some money to get back on your feet, a straightforward transaction to balance the scales. But the more we've talked, the more I've realized that would be insufficient, perhaps even disrespectful to what you gave me." Michael raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was heading, a lifetime of disappointments making him reluctant to hope. "You're intelligent, Michael. Observant. You understand people and systems in a way that can't be taught in business schools or executive training programs. And you have a perspective on life that most people in my circle will never experience, a perspective that I've come to believe is invaluable." James paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I want to offer you a job." "A job?" Michael repeated, skepticism evident in his voice, the word itself feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years of unemployment. "Doing what? I haven't worked in years. My skills are outdated. I don't exactly have references or a permanent address or professional clothes." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the hospital-issued robe and slippers that had replaced his tattered street clothes. "I'm launching a new division within Harrington Enterprises," James continued, undeterred by Michael's doubts, his voice taking on the confident cadence he likely used in boardroom presentations. "The Harrington Foundation for Urban Renewal. Its mission will be addressing homelessness in this city, not just through temporary shelters or soup kitchens, but through comprehensive programs that provide pathways to stable housing, employment, healthcare, and dignity." He leaned back slightly, watching Michael's reaction carefully. "I want you to help shape it. To be a consultant initially and potentially take on a more permanent role if you're interested. Your insights would be invaluable in creating programs that actually work, that address the real needs of people living on the streets, not just what looks good in corporate social responsibility reports or generates positive press coverage." Michael stared at him, momentarily speechless, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Of all the scenarios he had imagined for his future, returning to the streets, perhaps finding a bed in a shelter until spring, maybe securing a spot in a transitional housing program if he was extraordinarily lucky. This had never been among them. "You can't be serious," he finally managed, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. "I'm entirely serious," James replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I've already allocated $50 million as initial funding for the foundation. The board of directors has approved the concept. I've secured office space in our downtown headquarters and begun preliminary discussions with city officials about potential partnerships." He spoke matter-of-factly, as if these massive sums and institutional arrangements were routine considerations. "I'm prepared to offer you a 6-month consulting contract to start. Competitive salary, comprehensive health benefits, housing allowance, transportation stipend. At the end of 6 months, we can reevaluate. Either extend the contract, discuss a permanent position, or part ways with no obligations." Michael shook his head slowly, overwhelmed by the scale of what James was proposing. "Why me? There are professionals who study homelessness, who have degrees and experience in social work, in urban planning, in nonprofit management. People with credentials and networks and unblemished employment histories. And we'll hire them too," James acknowledged with a slight nod. "But they don't have what you have. Lived experience. They haven't navigated the system from the inside, haven't experienced firsthand how policies translate to realities on the ground. The foundation needs both perspectives to be effective." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Besides, this isn't just about what you can do for the foundation. It's about giving you an opportunity to rebuild your life on your terms, with dignity. To use your experiences, even the painful ones, perhaps especially those, to create something meaningful." Michael looked down at his hands resting on the polished wood of the cane. Cleaner now than they had been in years, the nails trimmed and buffed by a kind nurse who had noticed his self-consciousness, but still bearing the calluses and scars of his life on the streets. Hands that had once built cabinets and furniture with precision, then later rummaged through dumpsters for food, collected recyclables for pennies, and extended what little help they could to others in similar circumstances. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing alongside his tentative hope. "Live in your world. Meet your expectations. Function in offices and meetings in whatever corporate environment you're imagining. I've been away from all that for so long. I don't even remember how to." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the vast gap between his recent existence and what James was proposing. "I'm not asking you to become someone you're not," James said gently, his voice free of the condescension Michael had braced himself for. "Just to bring who you are, exactly who you are, with all your experiences and insights, to a different environment, to a different kind of work than you're used to." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between them. "This contains the formal offer. Salary details, job description, benefits package, everything spelled out clearly. Take some time to think about it. Talk to the social worker if you want an outside perspective. This is your decision, Michael. No pressure, no obligations, no right or wrong answer." Michael stared at the envelope as if it might suddenly vanish. A mirage in the desert of his life. A hallucination born of medication and wishful thinking. The Harrington Enterprises logo was embossed on the heavy cream paper, making it look official, substantial, real. "And if I say no?" he asked, needing to understand the boundaries of this offer, the conditions that might be hidden beneath its surface. "Then I still help you get back on your feet." James said without hesitation, his gaze steady and sincere. Set you up with an apartment, some funds to tide you over while you figure out your next steps. The medical care, the recovery support. Those aren't contingent on anything. They're already taken care of, regardless of what you decide about the foundation. A nurse approached, politely informing them that it was time for Michael's medication and respiratory therapy session. James stood, picking up the envelope and placing it on Michael's bedside table where it would be waiting when he returned. Think about it, he said simply, squeezing Michael's shoulder lightly. We can talk more tomorrow, or the day after if you need more time. There's no rush. That night, long after the hospital had quieted for the evening, after the night shift nurses had completed their rounds and the hallway lights had been dimmed, Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The envelope sat unopened on his table, simultaneously representing everything he had ever wanted and everything that terrified him. A second chance, a purpose, a way back into a world he had stopped believing he could rejoin. But also expectations, responsibilities, the possibility of failure, of disappointing not just himself, but the man who had inexplicably placed such faith in him. He thought about his life before homelessness, the small apartment he had once been proud of, the satisfaction of completing a difficult woodworking project, the simple pleasure of having keys in his pocket and a door he could close against the world. He thought about his life after, the constant vigilance required for survival, the invisibility he had both resented and relied upon, the community of other homeless individuals who had taught him the unwritten rules of street life, some of whom had become something like friends. Could he really bridge those worlds? Could he translate his hard-won knowledge into something that would benefit others? Could he trust this opportunity, this man, this chance that seemed too perfect to be real? Outside his window, the city lights twinkled in the darkness, a constellation of lives being lived in apartments and houses he had only observed from the outside for so long. Car headlights traced patterns on the streets below, people returning home from late shifts or nights out, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own version of normalcy. Somewhere out there was the underpass, where he had given away his blanket. A simple act of kindness that had somehow altered the trajectory of his life in ways he was still struggling to comprehend. As dawn began to lighten the sky, painting the horizon with tentative strokes of pink and gold, Michael reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing with certainty. He couldn't go back to the life he had been living. Not now. Not after glimpsing what might be possible. With a deep breath, he broke the seal and began to read the document that could change everything. A contract offering not just employment, but redemption. Not just housing, but home. Not just survival, but the chance to thrive. The day of Michael's discharge from the hospital dawned bright and clear. A crisp winter morning with sunlight glinting off fresh snow. He stood by the window of his room one last time, dressed in clothes he still couldn't quite believe belonged to him. A charcoal gray wool sweater, comfortable jeans that actually fit, leather boots that cushioned his feet instead of pinching them, all selected by a personal shopper James had arranged, who had arrived with racks of options in a respectful manner that put Michael at ease despite his initial discomfort. "Ready?" James asked from the doorway, car keys in hand. Michael turned, nodding slowly. After 2 days of careful consideration, he had accepted the job offer. A decision that still felt surreal, as if he might wake up at any moment to find himself back under the underpass. This entire experience, nothing more than an elaborate dream, born of fever and hope. "I think so," he replied. picking up the small duffel bag containing his new possessions. Toiletries, a few changes of clothes, books, a smartphone he was still learning to use. His old belongings had been respectfully disposed of, too damaged by weather and wear to salvage, though the hospital staff had carefully preserved the few items of sentimental value. A tarnished watch that had been his father's, a dog-eared photograph of his mother, a small carved wooden bird he'd made in his previous life. The discharge process was swift and dignified, nothing like the hurried exits he'd experienced from emergency rooms in the past. The medical staff wished him well with genuine warmth. His primary doctor reviewed his follow-up care instructions once more, emphasizing the importance of the medications James had already arranged to have delivered to his new residence. The respiratory therapist gave him a final set of breathing exercises to practice daily. Even the hospital administrator came to shake his hand, treating him like any other valued patient rather than a charity case. Outside, a sleek black SUV waited at the curb, its engine running to keep the interior warm. A driver in a dark suit opened the door as they approached, nodding respectfully to both men. "This is Thomas," James explained as they settled into the plush leather seats. "He'll be available whenever you need transportation, to appointments, to the office, anywhere you need to go." Michael's protest died on his lips as the vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb. He had already learned that some of James's generosity was non-negotiable, offered not as charity, but as practical solutions to ensure the success of his investment. Both in Michael and in the foundation they would build together. "Where are we going?" Michael asked, watching the familiar city streets from this unfamiliar vantage point, everything looking different when viewed through clean windows rather than from sidewalks. "To your new home," James replied with a small smile. "I hope it meets your approval. If not, we can look at alternatives." The drive took them out of the downtown area, past the neighborhood where Michael had once rented his small apartment, into an area of the city he had rarely visited. A quiet district of renovated brownstones and small, well-maintained apartment buildings, with tree-lined streets and corner cafes. Thomas eventually pulled up before a 4-story brick building with large windows and a small, tasteful sign identifying it as the West Ridge. "It's a converted factory," James explained, as they ascended in the elevator. The developer preserved the original architectural elements while creating modern living spaces. "I thought you might appreciate the craftsmanship." The apartment was on the top floor, a corner unit with high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and windows that flooded the space with natural light. It was furnished simply but comfortably, with pieces that emphasized quality over ostentation. A small dining table by the kitchen, a comfortable sofa facing a modestly sized television, a desk with a computer, bookshelves with a starter collection of titles, a bedroom with a queen-sized bed and linens that looked softer than anything Michael had slept on even before becoming homeless. "It's too much," Michael said quietly, standing in the center of the living room, overwhelmed by the space, the light, the silence. No roommates, no shelter coughs, no traffic noise from beneath an underpass. "It's what you need to succeed in your new role," James countered gently. "A safe, comfortable place to rest and think. The foundation will be demanding work. You'll need somewhere to decompress." He showed Michael through the rest of the apartment, the fully stocked kitchen with basic cooking equipment, the bathroom with its rainfall shower and soaking tub, the small second bedroom set up as a home office. A tablet on the coffee table controlled the apartment's systems: heat, lights, entertainment, security. "The refrigerator and pantry are stocked with essentials," James explained. "I've arranged for meal delivery for the first week while you settle in, but after that you can cook or order in as you prefer. Your salary will more than cover it." Michael ran his hand along the smooth countertop, trying to reconcile this reality with where he had been just a month ago. "When do I start work?" he asked, needing structure, needing purpose to anchor him in this new life, before he floated away on disbelief. "Monday," James replied. "That gives you 4 days to settle in, rest, continue your recovery. Thomas will pick you up at 9 a.m. on Monday and bring you to the office. I've arranged for an orientation session, introductions to key team members, and an overview of our initial objectives." After showing Michael how to use the various systems in the apartment and making sure he had contact numbers for any emergencies, James prepared to leave. At the door, he paused, his expression serious. "I know this is overwhelming," he said quietly. "A month ago, your life was entirely different. It's a lot to process." Michael nodded, unable to find adequate words for the tumult of emotions within him. "Take it one day at a time," James continued. "You don't have to figure everything out at once. And, Michael," he hesitated briefly, "it's okay to enjoy this, to accept it. You've earned it, not just by helping me that night, but through your resilience, your intelligence, your humanity in the face of circumstances that could have stripped those qualities away." After James left, Michael stood alone in his new apartment, silence enveloping him like a physical presence. He moved slowly from room to room, touching furniture, opening cabinets, looking out windows, convincing himself that this was real, that he wasn't hallucinating or dreaming. In the bathroom, he caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror and paused, startled by his own reflection. The gaunt, weathered man with wild hair and hollow eyes was gone. In his place stood someone beginning to resemble the Michael Sullivan of before. Still thin, still bearing the marks of his ordeal, but cleaner, healthier, standing straighter. The hospital had trimmed his hair and beard, transforming them from necessities of homelessness into intentional style choices that framed his face rather than hiding it. He looked, he realized with surprise, like someone who might belong in this apartment, like someone who might have valuable contributions to make in a corporate office, like someone with a future. The thought was so overwhelming that he had to sit down, perching on the edge of the bathtub, his breathing coming quick and shallow until he remembered his exercises, forcing himself to inhale slowly, to exhale completely, to ground himself in this moment rather than spiraling into panic. The next 4 days passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. He slept for hours in the comfortable bed, his body still healing, still making up for years of vigilant, interrupted rest. He experimented with the shower, marveling at the simple luxury of hot water that didn't run out, of being able to stand under the spray without watching the clock or feeding quarters into a machine. He explored the neighborhood cautiously, venturing a little farther each day, learning the locations of the corner market, the pharmacy, the local coffee shop where he forced himself to order and sit for 15 minutes, practicing being in public spaces as a customer rather than an unwelcome presence. Each new experience was both exhilarating and terrifying, a step back toward a world he'd been exiled from for so long. Using a credit card, receiving packages, making choices about what to eat based on preference rather than necessity. Sleeping without one eye open, without his few possessions clutched close to his body. On Sunday night, he laid out his clothes for the next day. A business casual outfit the personal shopper had selected, conservative enough to be professional, but not so formal that he would feel like an imposter. He set an alarm, though he knew he would likely wake before it sounded, his body still attuned to early rising after years on the streets. As he stood at his window, looking out at the city lights, he thought about the people he had left behind. The community of homeless individuals who had shared information, warnings, occasionally food or supplies, who had watched out for each other in small ways within their limited means. Some faces came to him clearly. Old Pete with his Vietnam War stories, Maria who sang to herself in Spanish when she thought no one was listening, Derek who had lost his job and family to addiction but still managed to maintain a gentle humor. Would they believe where he was now? Would they resent his good fortune or find hope in it? Could he find a way to reach back, to extend to others the same lifeline that had been thrown to him? The questions had no immediate answers, but he knew they would inform his work with the foundation. His experience would give him insights others lacked, would help him identify the gaps in services, the barriers to re-entry that kept people trapped in homelessness, even when they desperately wanted to escape it. For the first time in years, Michael Sullivan went to sleep with a sense of purpose. Not just the purpose of survival, but of contribution, of using his hard-won knowledge to create change, of transforming his suffering into something meaningful. Monday morning arrived with weak winter sunshine and a light dusting of fresh snow. Michael was awake before his alarm, showered and dressed with time to spare, his nervousness manifesting as excessive punctuality. When his phone buzzed with a text from Thomas announcing his arrival, Michael took one final look around the apartment, his apartment, and stepped out to begin the next chapter of his improbable journey. The Harrington Enterprises headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of a gleaming downtown skyscraper, its glass and steel exterior reflecting the morning light. The lobby was a soaring space of marble and polished wood, with uniformed security personnel and a reception desk staffed by professionals with perfect smiles and discreet earpieces. Thomas escorted him through security, where an ID badge was waiting for him. Michael Sullivan, Special Consultant, Harrington Foundation, and then to an express elevator that whisked them to the 47th floor without stopping. The foundation offices are still being completed, Thomas explained as they exited into a corridor of glass-walled meeting rooms and open work areas. For now, you'll be working from the executive floor, directly with Mr. Harrington and his core team. Michael nodded, his mouth suddenly dry, his palms damp with nervous perspiration. He was acutely aware of the curious glances from employees they passed, wondering what story James had told them about this newcomer, what they might have heard about his background. Thomas led him to a corner office with views of the city in two directions. James was waiting, rising from behind his desk with a warm smile. "Michael, welcome. How are you settling in?" "It's an adjustment," Michael replied honestly, "but a good one." James nodded understandingly. "Today will be about orientation, getting you familiar with the building, the team, our initial plans for the foundation. Nothing too demanding yet." He gestured to a conference room across the hall where several people were gathering. "Ready to meet the team?" Michael took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Ready," he said, surprised to find that beneath his anxiety, it was true. He was ready. Not just for this meeting, but for whatever came next. Ready to reclaim his place in the world. Ready to help others do the same. As he followed James into the conference room, Michael thought again of that frigid night under the underpass, of the simple decision to share his blanket with a stranger. He couldn't have imagined then where that small act of kindness would lead. Not just to his own salvation, but to the opportunity to create something that might extend that same lifeline to countless others. One blanket shared on the coldest night of the year, one moment of humanity in the midst of desperation, one connection made across the vast divide of circumstance and privilege. Sometimes, Michael realized as he took his seat at the table, prepared to begin his new life, the smallest kindnesses could create the most profound changes. And sometimes, second chances appeared in the most unexpected ways, offering not just redemption, but the opportunity to transform suffering into purpose. He was ready.